Hey crafter, today I'm going to share 3 ways to upcycle glass jars and turn them into cute decor pieces. For this first jar, I was inspired by the style of pottery or ceramics. I'm not sure exactly what the correct term is, but I wanted to imitate this chalky white finish with a textured sandy tone around the bottom. I first painted the jar using some white chalk paint from Hobby Lobby, and I did 2 coats to get an even coverage. You can see a lot of the brush marks in the chalk paint, in part because I'm using a cheap paintbrush, but personally I liked that added bit of texture, and since the paint strokes were visible, I made sure to paint in the same direction all the way around. After the white paint was dry, I taped off the bottom section to add my color and some texture. Now, this was one of those projects where what I was envisioning is not what actually happened, so I ended up trying 3 different looks before I settled on something that I liked. For my first attempt, I mixed some brown acrylic paint in with the chalk paint to create a light tan. I wasn't very happy with the color that I mixed up, but I decided to test it out on the bottle anyways. Once my color was all mixed up, I added some sand to give it a chunky texture, mixed it all up, and then I used a brush to sponge the mixture onto the bottom of the jar. While the paint was still wet, I removed the painter's tape and decided that I absolutely hated this color against the white chalk paint. So once that fully dried, it was on to attempt number 2, which was to try mixing a different shade of brown and painting over the textured area. Once more, I hated the results because the color I was envisioning was not the color I was mixing up. And finally what I realized was that the color I was trying to achieve was pretty much the color of the sand, so I shifted gears and decided I would just glue the sand along the bottom versus coating the sand in paint to achieve the color. To do this, I first painted the bottom of the jar with tacky glue, and then I rolled the jar in sand that I spread out on a cookie sheet. While the glue was still wet, I removed the tape again, and this looked so much better and the texture was better than when I mixed it in with the paint. I just feel like it gave a smoother look. And I also did the glue and sand on the lid just to test it, but I'm not a fan of how the lid turned out. But anyways, despite the multiple attempts, I think this turned out pretty cute in the end. For my next jar, I wanted to create a sea glass effect, and to do that all we need is a little bit of water, some tacky glue, and food coloring. I made a mixture consisting of glue, just a little bit of water, and then several drops of green food coloring. If you want a more opaque jar, use less water or even skip the water completely. If you want more vivid colorations versus lighter pastels, then use more drops of food coloring versus less. Once it was all mixed up, I painted the exterior of the jar. To get the best results here, you will want to paint on thin layers. If you paint several thin layers and slowly build up, the brush strokes will blend in and nearly disappear. Now, I meant to make mine without water, but I added the water without thinking, so that meant I needed a lot more coats to get the coverage I wanted. So I started off good. I did a light layer and set it in the sun to dry. And as a little tip, while the layers are drying, store the paintbrush in a piece of plastic instead of cleaning it every single time between layers. So anyways, I needed to do several more layers to get the coverage I wanted, but after about 3 layers, I started getting lazy and just globbed the mixture on there. I highly recommend avoiding this because the globs will run and the finish will not be as nice. So for comparison, this first jar here is the jar that I painted in this video, and that mixture included water, and I painted the mixture on very thickly. Then this other jar is one that I painted with just glue and food coloring, no water added, and I slowly built up the color with several thin coats. As you can see, the one with thinner coats looks a lot better in the end. And just as a note, the unevenness of the final texture is not because of the water, it's because of how thickly I did the layers. So whether you decide to go with the water or not, be sure to paint thin layers. But in the end, it's a simple way to add a pop of color to your decor. For my last jar, I'm using an empty baby food container and I'm decorating it like a watermelon, which to me, watermelons are very summery, so I feel like it's fitting for the season. I first painted the lid a light green color, but I accidentally squeezed out too much paint and had to clean a lot of that off of the lid. Then I used this sparkly red paint that really ends up looking pink, and I used it to paint the jar itself. As a side note, chalk paint tends to stick better to glass than acrylic and it's less likely to scrape off, but I decided to just use what I had on hand and painted my project with the acrylic paint. After the lid and jar were dry, I mixed some green and black paint to create a darker green, and I added some details on the lid to look like the rind of a watermelon. I have another little watermelon jar where I left the lid a solid green, so here's a look at those 2 different options. Just go with whichever option you like best. To add seeds to the jar, you can either use paint or do what I did and use a Sharpie and just draw them on. The Sharpie might not give quite as good coverage, and that might just be because my Sharpie's a little dried out. The paint will give better coverage, but the Sharpie's a lot easier to get the details and be precise. You of course can arrange your seeds however you like. On this one I did them kind of lined up, but of course you could add the seeds randomly along the side. So here is the watermelon jar when it's completed. Of course you can repeat this on a larger jar or a jar of a different shape or size, but I personally think these little jars look so cute as watermelons. So there you have it, that's 3 ways to decorate glass jars. I'd love to hear in the comments which design you like best, and also let me know if you give this DIY a go. And before I leave, I want to mention that right now it is time to enter the Christmas in July Fairies giveaway. The entry period ends on July 14th, 2021, so be sure to find the entry video on my channel and enter the giveaway, and maybe you will be the lucky winner. But yeah, go check that out, and until I see you next time, happy crafting!